First of all, let me wish everyone a happy Mother's Day and thank you for joining in today. If you're fortunate enough to still have your mother, I hope you'll have some time to spend with her. And if you no longer have your mother, then I hope you can reflect on the many fond memories that celebrate her life. In either case, today is a day to honor and remember all the mothers and mother figures in our lives and what they mean to all of us. Our Sunday school lesson today is session 10 in the quarterly, and it comes from Luke chapter 22, if you follow along in your Bible. We stopped last week with Jesus being led from the Garden of Gethsemane by the temple guards at the direction of the priests and the elders. And most of the disciples fled into the darkness for fear of being arrested as well. But when Jesus was being led to the home of the high priest, John was known there. So he followed along with the mob. And Peter followed, but he kept a distance away in order to keep attention away from himself. After all, he had just cut off the ear of one of the people coming into the garden to arrest Jesus, and at this point, he was pretty much controlled by fear. Most of the homes of the wealthy and the powerful, we really don't think about priests being wealthy and powerful, or not in our community anyway, but in their homes, there was usually a courtyard around and a wall, and the wall had a gate, and it also had a gatekeeper. A servant or a slave normally was stationed at the gate to allow or disallow entry. Peter was not a familiar face at the home of the high priest, but John was. So John was allowed entry, and he spoke up for Peter, and that's why Peter was allowed entry in through the gate into the courtyard. And our first scriptures come from Luke chapter 22. We're going to do verses 54 through 57. They seized him, led him away, and brought him into the high priest's house. Meanwhile, Peter was following at a distance. They lit a fire in the middle of the courtyard and sat down together, and Peter sat among them. When a servant saw him sitting in the light and looked closely at him, she said, "This man was with him too." But he denied it. "Woman, I don't know him." Two people were referred to as the high priest. Annas had been a high priest. He was appointed by the Roman governor of Syria, and he had held the position of high priest during the time of John the Baptist. He still had a lot of influence over the priesthood, and he was the first one to interrogate Jesus on that night. But then Jesus was brought before Annas' son-in-law, Caiaphas, who was the actual high priest at the time. Now, likely the house where they were was the home of Caiaphas, but as the high priest, there was plenty of room for Annas, who maybe had even lived there, and all of the members of the Sanhedrin who were involved in the trial and the mockery of that night when Jesus was taken there. Peter continued to keep a safe distance away, but he was close enough to keep an eye on all that was going on. He had previously boldly stated that he would go to prison with Jesus, that he would die with him. And to Peter's credit, he is the one that sprang into action by drawing his sword in the garden. And during the initial activity of the night, he wasn't too far away from Jesus physically. However, there was a great spiritual distance separating them. Peter was still willing to follow Jesus, but not close enough to endanger himself. And unfortunately, there are believers today who also slip into that same predicament that Peter was in. We distance ourselves from Jesus, and it happens easily, especially when we falter in our prayer life, in our church attendance, in our spiritual disciplines that keep us close to him. Jesus doesn't move away from us, but sometimes we move away from him, and we call ourselves following, but not close enough to endanger ourselves, just like Peter did. Our very lives may not be endangered like his was, but our relationship, if we're close to Jesus and we let that be known, our relationship with some friends may be endangered, or our acceptance into some circle of people may be endangered, or even our financial security could be endangered because of job situations and people there, or a boss or somebody who does not have the same faith that we have. The night must have been a little bit chilly because there was a fire going in the middle of the courtyard. And there were many members that were in the mob that went into the garden who were sitting around the fire. And Peter actually sat with them sometimes. He would sit a little and then he would stand back a little. And as long as he stayed back in the dark, he was fairly safe. But once when he got into the light of the fire, the slave girl who was the gatekeeper when John spoke up for Peter to gain entrance recognized him. She didn't speak to Peter directly, but she probably he got a bit nervous. She hit a nerve when she said out loud to the crowd, this man was with him too. And you can just imagine Peter pulling his outer garment closer around himself and responding with, woman, I don't know him. And then he probably moved away from the light of the fire and into the darkness out about in the courtyard. Peter really didn't have a traitor heart, not like Judas, but he did follow Jesus. I mean, he even if it was at a distance, and he really genuinely loved Jesus. This was a man that he had left his livelihood and spent 3 years with. He watched him, he learned from him, and he ministered with him. And if you remember, Peter was usually one of the 2 or 3 that he would send on a special mission. He sent him into Jerusalem to get the donkey. He sent him there to make arrangements for the Passover meal. But Peter wanted to know what was happening, and he wanted to help, but he did not want to experience what was happening to Jesus. Jesus was being questioned. He was being ridiculed and slapped and hit in the face. The atmosphere in the courtyard was highly charged. And when the woman identified Peter as one of Jesus' followers, the rush of fear and the desire for self-preservation took over. In our culture, we may not fear arrest or a loss of life, but there are occasions when we choose to stay silent instead of taking a stand because we're afraid of the repercussions that we may face. And Peter got by with his denial and his deception for a short while, but now he had become a person of scrutiny. The slave girl at the gate had pointed him out, so people are probably looking closer at him now. And it wasn't long before another person recognized him, as we'll see in the next scriptures, which would be 58 through 68. After a little while, someone else saw him and said, "You're one of them too." "Man, I am not," Peter said. And about an hour later, another kept insisting this man was certainly with him, since he's also a Galilean. But Peter said, "Man, I don't know what you're talking about." This next accuser must have been in the mob at the garden because he said, "You're one of them too," meaning them, the larger group of the disciples that were in the garden earlier in the evening. And at that moment, Peter probably wanted to be anything, anywhere, and anyone other than who he was. He replied a little more emphatically that he was not with them. He was afraid that what was happening to Jesus would befall him if the guards were convinced that he was one of Jesus' followers. He got by a little bit longer with his denials, but the next accuser was more fervent. And as a proof of him saying that Peter certainly was with Jesus, he stated that Peter was a Galilean. And Jesus was known to be from Galilee. So he just added it up together. Jesus was from Galilee. Peter is a Galilean because he has that distinct dialect or manner of speech that comes from Galilee. And we know about that. Our Southern Accent can be picked out in a crowd of New Yorkers or Bostonians. We can hear people talk and sort of figure out the area of the country where they're from. And Peter's danger level now was getting higher. He might not have known it, but this third accuser was a relative of the servant whose ear was cut off by Peter in the garden. This time, Peter cursed, and he swore an oath with his response. Maybe he thought that using crude language would increase his chances of making the people in the courtyard believe that he certainly could not be one of Jesus' followers. Or, in his fear, he may have reverted and resorted to his former fisherman's language. You know, we all hear about the language of men on boats, and it might not be true. We hear that. But with every identification, Peter reacted more harshly and denied Jesus more fervently. He evidently was to the point of being overwhelmed by his fear, and he would say anything to save himself. The way we speak, not just our words, but also our tone, should reflect that we have been with Jesus instead of fitting into the secular world. And in our secular world, we have some pretty crude verbal vulgarities that seem to be acceptable in the culture. We come now to the last scriptures for today, which would be 60, the second part of verse 60 through 62. Immediately, while he was still speaking, a rooster crowed. And then the Lord turned and looked at Peter. So Peter remembered the word of the Lord, how he had said to him, "Before the rooster crows today, you will deny me 3 times." And he went outside and wept bitterly. Now, if you remember, the new day for them started in the early evening, because Jesus said to Peter that before the rooster crows today, and he was arrested at night, but their day started in the early evening, and he had been under interrogation all night. And this rooster crowed early in the next morning, around 3 o'clock in the morning, I read somewhere. So it was the same day. It was exactly as Jesus had told Peter that it would happen. And before Peter could finish his third denial, that rooster crowed on the same day that Jesus foretold of the denials. On any other occasion, a sound of a rooster would probably be completely ignored. But on this morning, the timing connected Peter with the words of the warning from Jesus to him, and the sound from that rooster was deafening to Peter. And not even worse than that, it coincided with Jesus being brought into the courtyard. And from a distance, his eyes, he turned, and his eyes met Peter's with a direct and an intense moment. And it was not just a glance. He didn't just glance there and turn away. But it was not a glare or a scowl either. But it was a heart-piercing look that conveyed Jesus' sadness. It was not condemnation that he looked upon Peter. And Peter realized that Jesus knew. And he realized that maybe he even heard that last denial when he spoke so crudely and boldly. And the emotion that he felt was overwhelming. So before this night, Peter would have argued with anyone, any of the other disciples, anybody, that he would be the last person to fail Jesus. And he would be the last one to lose his courage in any situation. He promised to die with Jesus if necessary. And he would have never imagined any denial, much less 3, back to back, one right after the other, would be written into his story. Jesus knew Peter better than Peter knew himself. He knows us better than we know ourselves sometimes. He knows our weaknesses, and he knows the desires of our hearts. But Jesus still loved Peter, and he was not giving up on him. You may have heard a song that's titled, He Didn't Throw the Clay Away. Some of the lyrics say, "When I stumble and fall and my vessel breaks, he picks up the pieces. He doesn't throw the clay away." He didn't discard Peter, even with Peter's denials And he doesn't discard us, even when we distance ourselves from him. He waits patiently for us to turn to him again. And with the grief over what he had done, Peter didn't hang around any longer to learn of Jesus' fate. The pressure of the moment had cracked him, and he walked away in shame. He left the courtyard and he wept bitterly, bitter tears, because he could no longer contain his emotions. Remorse filled him, but his tears could not undo what he had done, and they could not erase the memory from his mind. He probably heard that rooster crow many times over that night in his mind. Peter's story reminds us that genuine believers can and do experience moral failures, but it's also an illustration of God's grace toward his children. Not only was Peter forgiven and he was restored by Jesus, but he was also given great opportunities for ministry, which he did embrace boldly and courageously. That same song, He Didn't Throw the Clay Away, says, empty and broken, I came back to him. A vessel of honor I am today, all because Jesus didn't throw the clay away. Peter's story is also a reminder to believers to treat those who falter in the body of Christ with the same mercy and forgiveness that Jesus demonstrated to Peter and he demonstrates to us. We must not be guilty of quickly writing off fellow Christians who fall into a season of disobedience. Peter's failure and his eventual restoration through repentance and grace reminds us that a victorious Christian life is not a sinless life, it is a repentant life. Once again, I want to thank you for joining today. Hope you'll have a great Mother's Day, the rest of the day, and a blessed week. And I hope you'll join again next time. Thank you for your time this morning.